Hello, everyone. I believe we are live. I just want to make sure. All right. I see some folks in the queue there. Well, I am Julia Pyper, and I'm the host of the Political Climate Podcast. I'm also a contributing editor at Green Tech Media and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And with me, I have Ellen Dorsey, the executive director at the Wallace Global Fund.
Hi, Julia.
Hello. I just want to make sure that we are indeed live and people can hear us before we continue on here. So just give us a moment. Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for the feedback there in the comment section. Just wanted to make sure we're using all this new technology. Okay, great. Well, we are going to talk about divestment and investment in this conversation, and Ellen is the perfect person to talk to about all this, having 10 plus years. I think we were just saying that you've been focused specifically on this work. So there's a lot to talk about here, but I'd appreciate just getting setting the stage with a bit of a summary of, how this movement came to be, the DivestInvest movement. The Wallace Global Fund, where you're executive director, has been instrumental in supporting fossil fuel divestment in the US and around the world. It's a leading member of the DivestInvest coalition. So give us a brief history of how the movement emerged and how you describe where it sits today.
Great. Thanks, Julia. And hello to everyone. I wish we were all together. I think as these months crawl on, the need to be together and have human contact just grows. So I look forward to a future year where we can be face to face. I was thinking it has been 10 years because it was really the context of 2010 when there was a failure to get a global agreement on climate in Copenhagen, and when myriad efforts to pass legislation nationally around the world failed, and in the U.S., in particular, Waxman-Markey, it left a really demoralized climate advocacy community. There wasn't a grassroots climate movement. And really, the governments were failing to act at scale commensurate with the settled and known science. And so it was clear that we needed to do something different. Foundations, my sector, were spending millions to support policy work, advocacy, educating about the science. And, those youth activists that existed were being bussed down to lobby for public policy du jour. And really the fight needed to turn onto the industry itself, the industry that was spending tens of millions to spread disinformation about climate change, to lobby for inaction, etc. So students began to take a play from the anti-apartheid movement's playbook when the U.S. government refused to impose sanctions on the apartheid state. Activists, faith and youth activists started calling on institutions to withdraw their investments from the companies doing business in South Africa. So in 2011, the first student campaigns got cooked up. There were about 8 campuses. It spread to 40 quickly. Then, as a combination of the brilliant work of Carbon Tracker and the brilliant advocacy of Bill McKibben, the call to divest was launched, and 40 campuses went to 400 overnight. It began spreading, and it spread to faith groups and pension funds and cities and philanthropies out of the U.S. and around the world. Today, 10 years later, there's now $14 trillion in assets under management that have publicly committed to divest from fossil fuels, and many, many more. And I think what I would just say as what's sort of the state of the movement today, not only has the movement created this incredible momentum for divestment, but it's spread to other strategies targeting the fossil fuel industry, including calling on banks to stop financing new fossil fuels, insurers to stop underwriting fossil fuels, litigation targeting the industry for damages, calls for governments to stop subsidizing the industry, and politicians to stop taking money from fossil fuel companies or their executives so that we can get government to regulate for the public good, not for corporate profit.
Yeah, there's a lot of elements to this, a lot of different areas you can go at it. And I know you've been doing a lot of them, working on a lot of those issues. I guess, what would you say is driving this? I mean, I'm sure there's a moral imperative. I know there's an economic one as well, but to what extent does it break down along those two lines, would you say?
Well, first and foremost, what first drove this was a moral imperative. 10 years ago, the finances of the fossil fuel industry and the influence. Hey, hi, Amy.
Hello.
You're not live yet, are you? Oh, we are. You're live. Okay.
You're live too.
We will start over and we'll do the full. Sorry, people are just now joining. Sorry.
Okay, great. Oh, someone had just said they can hear us. Fantastic. Okay.
Sorry. So we ran a little over. So we have a break after this. So we'll get the full 30 minutes in. And so we'll just start. I'm so sorry, you guys. You can also, if you want to keep that.
Brilliant while you were gone. No, going on and on.
I was like, maybe I'll just wait one moment. Great. So are we live now or no? I see live on the screen, so
we're
it's hard
live.
to do.
We're live.
Okay, good.
Yeah, we're live. Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to do a quick introduction of our friends, Julia and Ellen. We are now live. Welcome, everyone, to Political Climate, interviewing Ellen Dorsey of Wallace Global Fund. Ellen is Executive Director of Wallace Global Fund and founder of DivestInvest, which you'll hear more about shortly. Julia Pyper. Julia, I'm so pleased to have you back and your team from Political Climate. And we always love having you with us, your insights, your insightful questions, and the conversations that come out. Thank you very much for joining us again. Julia is the host of Political Climate and is also with Green Tech Media. Political Climate is a podcast of USC Schwarzenegger Institute. And Julia previously has been published in the New York Times, and she worked for EE News from Capitol Hill to the Maldives, and so has quite a wide breadth of experience in climate reporting. So with that, I'm going to pass the session over to Julia to host Ellen, and we will start and we will go into the break so we can get that full 30 minutes from you all and just a fewer sessions for networking. Thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Hello, everyone. We did a little test start on our own, I suppose, not knowing the platform. So if you were around for that, I hope you stick around for this. We're going to tackle this question again, and thanks to Ellen for eloquently running through it. But I think we'll start from the top again. So my initial question to Ellen is to get a better sense of where we're at in this divest invest movement. Wallace Global Fund has been instrumental in crafting it. It's a founding member of the Divest Invest Coalition. And Ellen, you personally have been doing this, I think we were saying, for 10 years or so. So just to set the stage, what is a quick history of the Divest Invest movement, and where would you say it stands right now?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Amy, and thanks, Julia, and hello to everyone. I wish we were together in person. We were saying that it was really in the context of in 2010 when the efforts to get an international climate agreement failed at Copenhagen. Various efforts to get national policy failed, including in the U.S. with the failure of Waxman and Markey. It was a very demoralized climate advocacy community. Real reckoning that things weren't working, the strategies weren't working. My sector, philanthropy, had spent tens of millions of dollars investing in those policy plays, both globally and in the U.S. and nationally, and promoting settled science, promoting understanding and education about it, and yet we still had nothing. And the clock was ticking, and as we know, is now really ticking, which we have to discuss. So there was a real reckoning that we needed a different kind of advocacy. And in that moment stepped youth activists who had took a play from the anti-apartheid playbook. And you'll recall that the U.S. government had refused to impose sanctions on apartheid South Africa. And activists, youth and faith activists, launched a campaign calling on faith investors and universities to divest their funds from companies doing business in South Africa. So the youth activists started campaigns on 2011 on about 8 campuses that went to 40 very quickly, calling on their universities, largely for ethical reasons, to get out of fossil fuels. And it spread quickly. Then it was accelerated with incredible work that was done by Carbon Tracker, with the analysis of stranded asset risk married up to Bill McKibben's leadership in calling for divestment. And 40 campuses went to 400, started to spread to faith groups and pension funds and cities and foundations, et cetera. And now there's 14 trillion in assets under management that have publicly committed to divest, probably hundreds of millions more that haven't been so public about it. And the movement now has grown exponentially. It is a full-blown global social movement, and tackling other strategies as well as divestment, from calling on banks to stop financing new fossil fuels. We can't have new fossil fuels, and insurers to not underwrite, litigation against the industry for damages, calling on governments to stop subsidizing, and calling on politicians to refuse to take money from the industry so that politicians serve the public good, not the corporate benefit.
We're going to dig into more of those buckets that you laid out there. That was an excellent overview. I just wanted to go back to the impetus for this movement. I'm sure it involves both the moral imperative and an economic one, but how would you say that breaks down? What's really driving this right now?
Well, I would say, quite frankly, early on, it was the ethical imperative that drove the first campaigns, that if you were invested in fossil fuels, you own climate change. You could not distinguish yourself from the impacts of your investment. So ethically, it was no longer okay to be invested in an industry driving the problem and refusing to tender business plans consistent with the science. But and there was some sense that divestment could play a financial role and weaken the industry, but it was mostly an ethical call for action. But in that, ensuing decade, we've seen the growth in the clean energy economy and the growing financial stability of renewable energy. And so you start to begin to see the ethical and financial imperatives align. And when you think about the stranded asset risk analysis that, 9 years or 8 years ago seemed kind of a fringe notion, it is now so clear, when fossil fuels have been the worst performing sector for the last 6 years at the level of treasuries, it's not going to return. So I would say it's also a fiduciary imperative. Investors have been warned. These are risky investments in your portfolio. And if you're still holding them and losing money, I think you have some real vulnerability to your clients or to your investors that you haven't moved on it.
Yeah, I think we saw BP just in recent months did a major write down, and they're not going to pursue some of their projects. Just very laid bare there what's happening. It's interesting because I've covered the clean energy sector for a while, and we're only still seeing those oil majors at least dip a toe into the clean energy sector. So it's clearly more, teaching needs to happen on that side of the coin. But just on the public perception and on the moral imperative, rather, what are the lines? What is the framing that works, do you think? I'm imagining, these are business people. What resonates with them when you're having those kinds of conversations that you need to do this for moral reasons, frankly, for the planet?
Well, I just want to go back, to your last point about the fossil fuel companies and their investments in renewables. There's been fantastic research that by groups like Influence Map and others that show that the industry is actually spending more on marketing those green investments. Yeah, actually they are making in alternatives. So, it's important to go to scratch a little bit beneath the surface with the industries and investors too. Investors that are committing to divest or to invest in green solutions, they need to be held accountable that they're actually implementing that. On the messaging, I think at this stage, the messaging in the early days, I think, was very much about the ethical imperative and that we needed the industry to match the science. The industry's practices weren't matching the science. That's so clear now. And I think the arguments are just getting stronger and stronger at this nexus of ethics and returns and financial performance. I mean, really? What motivating you to trade off your social legitimacy by being invested in fossil fuels today and lose your shirt? It doesn't make sense.
And like you say, actively spend money on maybe, impairing the movement to clean energy, sequestering the science, things like that, where it's like if there's a money crunch going on, maybe they could be those funds could be placed somewhere better. So let's see, what would you say is maybe a big moment, a defining moment when a financial institution or a bank or whatever big player you want to point to, made an announcement that you thought, okay, we've really got something here. This is a moment where like we've got traction, and it can be recent or a little while ago, but I'm curious what you thought was a moment you got a real foothold.
I think it really has to be when the Rockefeller Brothers Fund made the public announcement that they were going to divest from fossil fuels. And a little behind the story, the behind the scenes story on that, when Ban Ki-moon announced he was going to do a high-level climate summit, which was intended to build momentum towards a successful global agreement, ultimately in Paris. The activists were mobilizing, the People's Climate March was announced, there was all this attention, and the divestment activists were working furiously. And in fact, we had a meeting in our office with some of the heads of the different organizations, and everyone was strategizing, like, when do we go public, that we have enough divested that we're credible? We're like, oh, it's got to be like 30 to 50 billion or it's not going to be credible. And so we made the decision that it was time to go big around Ban Ki-moon's summit, and we made the first global divestment announcement. It actually was taken into the UN summit, and we lined up some new announcements. DivestInvest Philanthropy had already been launched maybe 6 months before with about 17 foundations. We had another 55 that were going to join, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund was ready to announce. And we knew, because they had been working on it, and we knew that they're the heirs of Standard Oil. They had been engaging for decades in trying to get ExxonMobil to move on climate, and for them members of the family to come out and say, we're done. They're not going to move. It's not okay to be invested, and shareholder engagement isn't working. So we knew there'd be press, but it lasted for literally months. In fact, I think many of the members of the family and the Rockefeller philanthropic institutions have done that. Then I would say, World Council of Churches, the support of Desmond Tutu, all in the early days really assisted the movement. And now the mayors of London, New York, the financial centers of the world, big pension funds, it's just the dominoes just keep on, falling.
And just this week, I think Deutsche Bank announced it's banning financial support for drilling in the Arctic under public pressure. So the news keeps rolling in. We may come back to this fossil piece, but I want to make sure we have time for the other side of the equation here, the invest side. So what would you say is the specific role of philanthropies and other impact investors in supporting that side of the ledger, investing in climate solutions?
Julia, you're breaking up for me, and I don't know if it's my technology or yours. Can folks hear me?
No, I heard it stopped as well. Did it mute by accident, or let's see? We still can.
Amy, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, Ellen. Yeah, it just happened in the middle of Julia's last statement.
I respond to Julia's question while she looks at her technology.
Perfect.
Let me think. Okay, so the invest side. Early on, I think we were very aware in philanthropy that it was important that we also call on investors to commit to scaling renewables, to invest in clean tech and renewables, that we needed to accelerate the transition. And that by accelerating the transition, you're also making the renewable side of the equation stronger, further weakening the fossil fuels. So DivestInvest was always, for me, a robust theory of change. And, 5, 6, 7 years ago, I think it was Ceres that put out the first report saying that institutional investors needed to put at least 5% of their portfolio into renewables and clean tech if we were going to scale in time to be consistent with limiting at 2 degrees Celsius warming. That remains true. We still need to be investing, and I think investors need to be conscious of what the level of investment is in their portfolio. But now, in the context of the global change that we're experiencing, the global economic crisis driven by the pandemic, and the encroaching deadline, we have a decade left to fundamentally turn things around. We need to be thinking even more broadly than just investing in climate solutions. This really is a moment for profound system change. We need to be investing in the new energy economy that incorporates racial and social and gender justice alongside the climate justice. We need to be thinking about new ownership models of energy systems and other climate, regenerative ag and other climate solutions. And I know you've already been discussing that. So for me, any investor today needs to be thinking about investing in the solutions, but with full ESG integration in your portfolio, doing climate, racial, gender adjusted audits of your portfolio. You should have 5 to 10% of your portfolio in specific climate solutions. I think you need to be committing 1 to 5% of your portfolio to investing in local economies, job creation, community development. Think about how you can be a private investor investing alongside the public Green New Deals that will be created. And then I think we also have to make sure that we leave no one behind in the energy transition. There's 1 billion plus people that don't have access to electricity now. We can leapfrog heavy grid infrastructure and reach them. So as investors, we need to be thinking through that lens of leaving no one behind. You still need to divest, obviously, but I think there's plenty of opportunities to engage industries other than the fossil fuel industry, to decarbonize, to bring more resources into their communities, to create jobs, et cetera. So the changes in the world, we can't go on like they didn't happen. We need to be conscious about our role in creating the new energy economy, one that's just and prosperous for all.
All right. Can you hear me now? Yes? Okay, great. It's one.
Oh, we're losing you.
Again.
Julia, we're losing you.
I don't know. It doesn't seem like an internet problem. It seems like there's a technical glitch going on. So,
do you want me to opine a little bit more about Invest while you're sorting that out?
Yeah, why don't we do that? But also, we have a really good audience question about how do we influence the ridiculous 5 trillion plus in subsidies going to fossil fuels? Obviously, putting a big thumb on the scale for fossil fuels over the invest side, but Julia's back. Let's see if it works. And Julia, I mentioned
more. I don't know.
We hear you.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure where you left off. I personally was curious about some specific examples from Ellen on the invest side. So I don't know if that's where you were going, Amy, but I know that there's some renewable energy projects in Standing Rock that I think really represent what you were talking about, Ellen. So do you want to touch on that for a moment?
Yeah, Julia, let me answer a question that was raised from the chat while you were sorting the technology out on the fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, really, the fundamental underlying theory of change behind the divestment movement from its origins was to strip the social license of the industry to operate. And with it then, to toxify the industry and free politicians to be able to actually act in the common good. And that would include ending subsidies to the industry, not using public funds, our dollars, to subsidize this industry. And I think that if you look at the youth movement that started this, the youth movement that went on to create the demand for a Green New Deal, the youth movement that's striking, they're all pushing on no support for the industry, public or private, no funds at all. Greta's most recent remarks are everyone must divest now, stop all the subsidies. We've got to end this fossil fuel era. So I'll be frank, I don't think there is enough philanthropic dollars going to these fights against the fossil fuel industry. There's still way too much philanthropic money going to softer work rather than the hard-edged advocacy. And we need campaigners and grassroots activists to continue hammering on ending the fossil fuel industry. So the subsidies is a crucial issue, and we need to support those activists that are taking it on. Now going to Julia's. She said, talk about some of these interesting projects. One project we're involved in, we had supported the Standing Rock fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And in the context of interacting with the tribal government in that, supporting that fight and discussing what their needs were, we learned that they had early stage plans to build a grid scale wind farm that would bring revenue, that would be owned by the tribe and would bring revenue to the community, both to generate new renewable projects, but also for community development in one of the poorest communities. We heard that this is truly energy justice, given the Dakota pipeline fight. And this is the kind of model of the new energy economy that we need. And so we have been working with them over the last couple of years. It was very nascent. Now it's getting much closer to being ready for all of you to invest in it. But we've worked with the Sierra Club Foundation, some other foundations. We've put in some early stage pre-development capital. Now the wind studies have been done, the transmission line studies have been done. This is going to be an incredibly successful project when it's built. And we're working on an innovative impact investing model that will generate fair returns to the investors, as opposed to strictly a market return that will enable more resources to go back into the community. There are other projects that are happening on indigenous lands. There's the Navajo Solar Project. I think it's really important that we think of our role not just in investing in large-scale renewables that will bring us, healthy returns, but that we really look at the areas where we can have a profound impact with oftentimes a small amount of capital that can build the kind of momentum that addresses racial and climate justice simultaneously.
Excellent. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
We're going to get to one more question from the audience in just a second, but I wanted to parse out the policy point. You mentioned they're supporting advocacy. We're obviously in this moment of the COVID-19 crisis, and governments are talking stimulus bills. A lot of that government funding, billions of it, is going to fossil fuel companies. And there's been talk of a green recovery and supporting tenets of the Green New Deal, but that hasn't, at least here in the US, been put into legislation yet. So where do the philanthropies jump in on the policy front? Where does your work meet the policy making? Is it through that advocacy you talked about, or are there other levers you can pull? How would you describe that?
Well, first of all, we can support advocacy with our grant-making dollars. We can, support the frontline organizations and the smart strategic advocacy organizations. Then they're working very effectively in calling for the kind of just and green recovery that we need. And there are also coalitions that are tracking the bailout money and are exposing the misuse of the bailout funds, including going to fossil fuel companies. And they need support. They need financial support to do what they're doing and to do it effectively. We can also use our advocacy voice. We are able to lift up our advocacy voice in broad ways without targeting specific pieces of legislation. And all too often, I think philanthropy doesn't do that. And then we can use our voice as investors in shareholder engagement, et cetera. So I just think it's time for all foundations. Their mission will be impacted by climate change. We are supporting activists to push governments and corporations to declare a climate emergency. What would it look like if philanthropists declared a climate emergency? First of all, I would argue you would need a systemic theory of change. You need to support movements. You need to move your money aggressively. And I would challenge you to start giving more. Because the reality is, if we know we have a decade left and you're staying at existing levels of giving, there's something wrong. Why are we holding back and hoarding our acorns for a colder winter? Could there be a colder winter than what we're living through right now with 40 million unemployed, a global pandemic, and 10 years left with storms and fires barreling down on us in this August-September timeframe? Give more.
Excellent. That's an excellent answer. I'm just going to flip to a couple from the audience as we wrap up here. So first from Peter Seligman, do you have any insights on the European investors' call for the government of Brazil to ensure protection of the Amazon and indigenous peoples? Do you have any insight on that?
You know, Peter, I'm going to say no. I have a little bit of insight, but I'm not an expert on that. But it would be really good to connect with those groups like Amazon Watch that have been really in the forefront of work on protecting the Amazon and indigenous peoples. And I think what's really important is that investors go further than just calling on the government. It's good that they're doing that, but we also need to make sure that the oil companies and others, that we're using our pressure on them. One, we get out and we expose what they're doing and show that this is literally a kind of moral hate crime against the planet and against the people of the indigenous people there. So again, the campaigners need support, and we need to make sure that those investors that use their voice are actually driving hard and not just, making statements. And I'm not saying they are with this. This is a good thing. But more of us need to join in and use that kind of pressure on governments and on the corporations.
Another sort of related kind of question. This is from Mohammed Bilal. I see that I think we need to reset the elements of nature that have been distorted. Excuse me. What's your view on that?
Well, it's kind of a broad question. In theory and in principle, I think you're absolutely right. And I am finding it extremely frustrating to hear, given the magnitude of the crises that we're in, that we're using refrains like build back better. I don't think we need to build back better. We need to fundamentally transform our systems, our relationship with nature, the nature of our financial systems, frankly, the structure of capitalism globally. I mean, they're all integrated. And so, yes, redefining our relationship with nature is absolutely an essential part of that. So I'm not really feeling build back better right now. It's change, and dramatic change now. And with the kind of lens that isn't just a nature lens, but also a nature and justice lens. It's absolutely time that we bring racial and gender justice into our analysis of corporate behavior and financial behavior.
I think this is a question that I sometimes struggle with and want to think more about is what actors can do what when. So philanthropy is one group, and then there's investment with expectation of some kind of return. So Lawrence's question is, who can do what and at what scales? Not all entities act at the same millions and billions of dollars scale. So how do you break down who does what?
Well, we have to ascertain who we are as investors. Philanthropy, universities, there are endowments that are part of mission-driven institutions. We receive charitable tax status to serve the public good. I think there's a strong argument to be made that our investments shouldn't undercut the public good if we, in fact, are charitable institutions. But even institutions who are, this is the system change, we need to change the short-termism, the shareholder primacy as opposed to a stakeholder model. And these are the kinds of changes that need to happen. But even an existing institutional investor that is, in this model of the shareholder returns, I think we need to be thinking much more creatively about how the returns of our portfolio can also be balanced. Right now, imagine if every investor committed 1% into local communities for job creation, and they're structured in revolving loan funds, or 5%, and you get a fixed asset rate return. How is that not a prudent, maybe it's a little riskier in the projects, but you're getting the expected returns when you look at the whole portfolio's return. So I think we need to be constantly challenging the assumptions that drive the existing model while we push for change in the model itself, to go from that shareholder to stakeholder, to go from short-term to long-term, etc.
Great. I think this will be our last question, but sort of to put it to the individual level, which is the whole other bucket here of the banks and what us as individuals can do with our money and what the institutions are doing with it. So how should we move our money as individuals? How can we go with better credit unions, local banks, or is there a way to pressure big banks to do the right thing? What would be your advice to the audience here on that front?
Well, on the climate piece alone, banks have massively increased their financing for coal, oil, and gas since the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. Think about that. Between 2016 and 2019, 35 international banks, including Chase, Wells Fargo, Citibank, collectively poured $2.7 trillion into the fossil fuel industry. Let that sink in. That is since Paris. If you're banking with them, if you have credit accounts with them, then you are investing in the fossil fuel industry and in new fossil fuel projects that will lock in climate impacts and shoot us past the 1.5 degree. So it's absolutely crucial that we take on the banks and also take on the insurers that are insuring these projects. So you have the ability, either as an individual or as an institution, to first engage your banks and call on them to stop financing fossil fuels. And if and when they don't, you walk away, you cut up that credit card, and they begin to feel the pressure. They will stop investing in those fossil fuel companies. I am certain of that. They just haven't felt the heat as much, but there is a campaign called Stop the Money Pipeline that's been launched, and this year, and in a very short term, it's pressuring JP Morgan Chase and others. And I'm absolutely confident that when we protest outside the banks, we cut up the cards, we get investors and account holders to go into their annual meetings, you're going to start to see change fast.
Jane Fonda's doing a great job holding them accountable.
Well, Fridays.
Yes. Well, I apologize to everyone for my technical issues, but I'm grateful for you, Ellen, jumping on all the questions and ad-libbing a little bit there. So Amy, I'll hand it back to you. Thanks for this.
Thank you so much, Julia and Ellen, so much for joining us. It's so incredibly insightful and important. And thank you, Ellen, for your clarity and courage as a philanthropic leader, as an investment leader, as a voice among other philanthropies, to really show them the way. And it's time to be fearless and recognize the urgency.